Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Darcy Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today, July 12th, we will be hearing the presentation, Creating Safe Environments, Integrating Planning, Design, and Physical Security. Get my next screen up here. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your webcast toolbar. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can also type those in that chat box in your toolbar. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And as always, I ask that you include, if you'd like a specific person, a specific speaker to answer your question, to put that in the notes with your question so that I can make sure the right person answers it. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsors for 2019. So thanks to all of these chapters and divisions of APA for sponsoring and making these webcasts possible and free to their members. Today, in particular, we are thankful for the Pennsylvania chapter of APA for hosting today's session. So thanks to them for coordinating today. We're excited to hear the presentation. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. I'll tell you what, fall is around the corner and we already have a lot of webcasts coming down the pipeline for fall. So stay tuned because they're coming in. I know it's the middle of summer already, but we're talking fall. So go ahead and visit our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to register for these upcoming sessions. To log your credits for today's session, just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account, and from there you can search either by today's title or the event number. And don't worry if you don't get it written down fast enough, because both of these can be found again on our webcast webpage. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education on demand. We have one ethics, one law right now, and you can learn all about those and learn how you can view them and record them on our webcast webpage. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And hey, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have just about 300 sessions recorded and up there for you to view, and we have over 2,500 or almost 2,500 subscribers right now. So just head over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up, and be sure to subscribe and get notifications when we upload our sessions. And to that, this session is recorded and will be available at the end of today's session, and a PDF of this webcast will also be available at the conclusion of the session on our webcast webpage. Okay, I'm done with my intro, so I am going to turn it over to today's speakers. Herb, I'm turning the controls to you, sir.
Okay, we should be set.
If you could go up top to display settings and just hit swap. Thank you. Perfect. You're good to go. Whoop. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks, Christine, and good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to start by thanking all of you for attending today's webinar. Creating safe environments is a shared passion of ours. We feel an incredibly important topic as it relates to planning built environments, as well as the experiences we all have in the spaces and places we live and work in. We've found that the best way to create fundamentally safer environments is to think about the various ways we can integrate security and planning into design projects as just part of the overall approach versus an additive consideration. At AEWorks, we find this integration important, and so important that we've even included it in the practice in our mission statement, to transform the lives of people and organizations by creating stunningly beautiful, highly functional, and safer spaces. It's not enough to think about function and beauty. In an increasingly complex world, creating safer environments is required, and it does require planning with intention, nuance, and a team approach. So today, Herb and I are looking forward to sharing some effective strategies for making our environment safer from both the perspective of a physical security expert and a planner, and to show how planners can lead the way in creating fundamentally safer communities by re-examining our process of executing and reviewing projects. Next slide.
If your first slide is, oh, there you go. Okay, good.
Great. So first, to introduce myself, my name is Tiffany Hale, and I direct AE Works Planning and Strategy Service offering. I'm trained as an architect. I've worked as an urban designer and a planner on projects worldwide, and focus our work on creating strategies that move people and organizations forward. We like to take a collaborative approach to projects, focus deeply on understanding the client culture, people, and vision, and then apply data and design to tame those complexities as they relate to future planning projects and built environments. Herb?
So my background, Army straight out of college for 8 years, and last assignment I commanded an active duty company for 3 years. Our mission was not security, and in fact I found that security was frequently an obstacle to getting things done. At least that was my perception. I bring that up because it shaped the way I approach my work now. We try not to impact folks unless it's absolutely necessary. Moving on from that, I worked in IT a little bit, and then there was an opportunity to lead a physical security task for the Marine Forces Reserve. I was a contractor, and they're headquartered in New Orleans, so of course I jumped on it. By the way, if anybody's on from that area, I hope you fare well with this storm. It's an absolutely remarkable place there, and I wish you all safety with this coming weather. My team there, we inspected weapons vaults, and we did anti-terrorism work. Moved on from that after about 5 years for family reasons, and I've been at AE Works ever since. My work here has mostly been hospital campuses and some commercial space, and yeah, that's really it. We'll move on.
So as this presentation provides CM credits for the certified planners in the audience, we've established some key learning objectives focused on really 3 themes. So first, you'll hear us talk about the importance of creating teams of experts that all appreciate and are focused on integrating meaningful and effective security considerations into their work and the work of the team. Also, it's really important to we'll provide some key fundamentals and baseline knowledge of physical security planning, including risk assessments, CPTED, and such that Herb will take us through today. And then we'll also provide strategies and case studies that illustrate good ways to make safer existing and proposed environments, both figuring out how to keep safety in mind when starting a project, or even how to retrofit existing places to be more safe as the issues of safety and security become more complex over time. Just a short introduction on why Herb and I work together, perhaps. So our company, AE Works, is one that crafts the services we offer based on client needs and growing value. So this approach has actually led to offering both traditional built environment services like architecture and engineering, along with more upstream integrators such as project services, which focuses on management, estimating, and delivery, planning and strategy, and of course, security risk management that we'll be focusing on today. Specifically with the in-house security risk management offering, we integrate security into projects in a more streamlined, cost-effective manner. And this will give our clients that have access to this expertise up front. Given all these services, AE Works has experience supporting projects from concept and master planning all the way to post-occupancy. So let's get started with the key of the presentation. So we're going to start by defining what we consider to be a safe environment, so that we have a common understanding or language around what we're going to talk about today. In many ways, it's about focus. So safe environments are actually those where you don't really talk about safety at all because it's realized without distracting the person in the space or the experience of the space itself. So this allows people to use a space without concern, as we say there, about loss of life and property at top of mind because they're in a comfortable environment where things have already been considered. Next, we'll focus on what we find to be the key underpinning to creating safer environments, which is always to start with the overall team in mind. So simply put, we've found that assembling a multidisciplinary team as early as possible in the planning process is the most effective approach to integrating security into planning or building projects. Though this seems simple, the nuance comes not just with the early assembly of a team of experts, but also truly integrating that expertise. So, this audience many people are experts and work with experts every day. And so experts habitually focus on their own role. So in a lot of ways, the critical role of the planner in integrating this work is often most meaningful in making sure the team is truly integrated and looking at the project or the problem in the same way, the same factors. And our mission is often to fit the puzzle pieces together. Some of the measurable benefits to what might be considered a typical approach, especially when it comes to truly integrating physical security into the planning and design, are that it's usually most cost-effective to integrate it up front. So again, common sense, but if not considered, this also has an effect on design, as late integration can come with the look of late integration, and we're working very hard to not, be obtrusive in our environments. So the goal for planners is to really recognize and balance the allied disciplines early in the planning process for the greatest benefit. So next, we want to step back from the team a little bit and then quickly focus on the potential role of the planner in integrating this into projects, whether on a design or development team or actually as a municipal planner or reviewer. So the list of typical planning consideration here is no new news to most of you. Big picture, these are usually the key items planners consider and integrate into project reviews. Context, knowing how the project fits into its environment, controls, what's allowable or standard, what's nearby, what is the community like where the project is happening, and what are the issues most meaningful to that area. What we observe is that the community conversation is a key element of reviewing and participating in plan and project design. However, it rarely integrates safety and security in a detailed way during the planning stage. So we often see the focus on security consideration coming either in permitting or code compliance phases, and perhaps not even until, retroactive measures must be taken after a project is built and occupied. So we would argue, and know this from working closely together, that this traditional approach is pretty antiquated. Often a chief concern of communities voiced at public meetings is how a new project or a new plan will affect the safety of their community. But at this stage, it's often handled with some global consideration. If you have a physical security professional pulled in, either on the design development team or even helping the municipality in their review at earlier stages of a project, there's just a lot more opportunity for meaningful, hard data-driven analysis of actual threats in the area versus perceptions. And Herb's going to actually walk us through how he can integrate a little bit later in the presentation. But basically, by using the expertise of the security specialists, both design and municipal reviews and the resulting community conversations can be more focused and ultimately more meaningful and influential on the built outcomes. So why does it matter to engage physical security professionals like Herb up front? Well, typically it leads to more meaningful planning reviews because the issues of safety and security were broached early with certified professionals and using data and techniques honestly uncommon to planners when you review projects. Also, going back to the idea of engaging a multidisciplinary team, it's important when and how to engage security consultants, and generally doing this early and often is the right thing to do. Early engagement of these professionals also leads to better urban design plans by designers, more thoughtful reviews, because there's just more data up front. And finally, safe environment planning creates awareness, both within existing communities and of the needs that should accompany new building or site design proposals. Basically, all parties are better informed and better decisions can be made in the planning stage. So now we're going to shift gears a bit from the high-level perspective of what the planner can do to integrate the right security professionals at the right time and move to the mind of the physical security professional. And so as you'll see, our approaches to creating safe environments are different, but it'll be probably very familiar. The theories that Herb studies are the same as ours and likely be familiar to you as well. Herb?
Okay. So the nice thing about talking to planners is that you're all familiar with Jane Jacobs. So crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED is how you pronounce the acronym, What that is we're going to manipulate the built environment in order to reduce the incidence and or fear of crime. It's got its roots in Jacob's work, where the security takeaway was that the way we were doing urban planning at the time was actually causing crime to increase. Jeffrey followed her and actually coined the term, as well as had a few theories on criminal motivation. Following that, Oscar Newman with dispensable spaces, he really brought out the C and B scene and the culture of intervention. And then finally, we had broken windows theory in the 80s with Wilson and Kelling. So this is kind of just a brief overview of the theoretical foundation and where the security design has evolved from. So how do we manipulate that built environment? Well, we, among other things, we exercise these four tenets of SEPTED. Natural access control. There's got to be spatial definition. We don't want to have a million ways in and out of a private space. So we're going to minimize the entry possibilities, and we're going to locate those strategically. With natural surveillance, you want legitimate users of the space and the owners of the private space. They should be able to see everyone that's flowing through. We want to attract friendly eyes and have those eyes seeing what's going on out there. Desks facing windows, you put break areas in strategic locations, lighting so the bad guys know they can be seen and so the good guys can see them. With landscaping, plants, green space is good. We'll talk about that later. But we don't want those nice plants obstructing our views of doors and windows or to provide a hiding place for bad actors. Territorial reinforcement. So we're going to label the space. We're going to put up employees only or staff only signs. In a more controlled environment, we might actually have a reception desk in front of where we go from a public space like a lobby into a more private space like the doctor's office or the office building, et cetera. But we're going to have that space defined. We're going to make sure that it's conspicuous. I liken it to, if you've ever been at like the back of the house of a mall or a convention center, the minute you go from where you're supposed to be to the back of the house, you're not supposed to be there, right? The whole look and feel of the space changes. There's, you go from nicely finished walls, attractive, nice lighting to cinder blocks and bare fluorescent tubes. It becomes just a very functional space. You look and feel out of place. And the key there is looking out of place. So the legitimate users of the space immediately see you there as somebody that is either lost or somebody that's up to no good, which brings the second point of territorial reinforcement, which is an organizational culture thing. And if you don't have that type of interventionist, culture where people are empowered, your legitimate users are empowered to come up and say, excuse me, can I help you? Or in a more Department of Defense type context, show me your badge. That's where territorial reinforcement comes in. The owners of the space clearly know who's supposed to be where, and there's that natural desire to protect that space. That's what we're playing to there. And then finally, on the maintenance end, you don't want, as I said before, shrubs growing over your windows because they conceal somebody breaking that window and getting into your facility. Dilapidated fences, you can't tell if somebody's cut the fence because the whole thing's falling apart anyway. And other components of the broken windows theory. But, basically, if you have a dilapidated building, a broken window doesn't look out of place, so another broken window is not going to matter, even though that's a telltale sign of a break-in. Same thing for a door hanging open, or even, desperate-looking characters just kind of hanging out front. You can't really tell what they're up to. So consequently, nobody reports that. Why? It doesn't look out of place. Now, put any of those elements on a well-maintained building, or put them on a well-maintained campus, and they become very noticeable. And when people notice things, they can report things. So with very minimal investment, other than having a nice facility, which everybody wants anyway, let alone from the security perspective, you've achieved a much higher level of security than you would have otherwise. So that's a broad overview of SEPTED. It's super quick. I mean, you can literally spend half a master's degree program on SEPTED. So, we'll move on from there and do some more theory and definitions that I'd like to talk about. And the next one is passive versus active measures. So passive measures, as you see in the list there, they're things you install once and then you can leave them alone. There's a maintenance tail, right? You got to trim plants, you got to maintain doors, sometimes locks break, but it's relatively minor. And you'll see that the septet access control and natural surveillance really fall into those passive type measures. A key thing with those passive measures is that there's not a huge ongoing cost associated with them. Now, if we switch over to active measures, well, these you're paying by the hour for, right? We have guards, we have cameras that somebody's monitoring, we have alarms. Why is an alarm an active measure? Alarm in and of itself doesn't do anything. It shows that a door has been opened that shouldn't have been opened. I can still go into the building and rob everything, and as long as I get out before somebody responds to that alarm, I've robbed you. So the alarms fall into that active category because you need guards, you need police on the other side of it in order to actually execute, some kind of stoppage of a criminal act that's in place. Another thing on this, you'll notice that cameras appear on both the active and the passive lists. And that's because cameras do two things. And it really depends on your operational context with the cameras. So passively, cameras gather evidence. It goes to a DVR somewhere or an MVR, and it just stores footage, and that's all it does. It's great for evidence at trial. It's great for, HR termination, proceedings, stuff like that. But, that's all it's doing. You also have cameras that are actively monitored in, for example, in a lot of like mass transit situations where there's a security control center and all of those cameras feed into there. Someone is actively looking at those, and then they can immediately dispatch police, guards, et cetera, over to a scene where there's some kind of issue. So that's the active side of cameras. So they do both and realize that one isn't necessarily the same as the other. It really depends on what the intended use of those cameras is. So again, passive measures, install them once, don't have to do a whole lot afterwards. Active measures, ongoing cost for the clients in perpetuity. So just to take you through how these might, apply in a small building. This is a cannabis dispensary that we modified for this presentation. This isn't actually built anywhere, so I promise I'm not giving away the farm here. But we can begin to identify some passive measures that we might use in this office. For example, if you look at that at the top of your screen there, we've got an extra exterior door on the vault. All right. Code-wise, we ended up not needing that, so there's no point in having it. It's just an extra entry from the great outdoors into a very controlled space, so we got rid of it. We can add a wall between the staff area, which is a more private space than the dispensary floor. We can take one of the bathrooms, and instead of having both of those doors open into waiting, we can have one opening into the dispensary. What does that do? That prevents unnecessary traffic flow from a controlled space into an uncontrolled space, or a more controlled space to a less controlled space, if you will. And finally, we could create a vestibule down there and have somebody come in, show up to reception, present an ID card, and then they can be buzzed in, which gives us another layer. Again, we're installing those once, or making changes to plans pre-construction, and there's no ongoing cost. And that, especially when it comes to the vault door to the exterior, that's one of those, it's granted very small, but that's the value of invoking security early. All right, when this is just an architect's sketch, it hasn't even gone into Revit or any of the other design software. That's a very cheap and easy thing to make, right? The architect just draws a new line and you're done. Whereas if we had gone further, when you typically get your security reviews, now we're well through all of the other disciplines. The engineers have been in, they've run their electricity, they've run their pipes, they've done power, or even worse, once construction begins, and then we bring security in, and I say, we need to get rid of this door. Well, now we have a significant cost. So there is a cost avoidance to be had by involving security up front. So we talked about some passive measures. So just to show you what the active measures might be here. There's no arrows, but what we can do is we can add alarms. We can even zone areas differently. So for example, the garage and the vault, those aren't occupied during a normal shift, right? The stuff is stored in there overnight and they're occupied during deliveries, but otherwise they're not used. So we can zone those on a different alarm. So that way if somebody goes in there, they'll be detected when they're not supposed to be going in there. We could replace the receptionist with an armed guard. That's an active measure, and you have your response force right there. And we could, during off hours, if we wanted to, pay a police officer detail or, somehow coordinate for, a periodic patrol during off hours, we could do that. Those would be active measures. So before we move on to the next slide, this is the last little bit of theory, but it's fairly important, and I present it so you can understand why security does the things they do. I feel that, the more we understand about each other's professions, the better we're able to communicate, and, ultimately we can, achieve the desired outcomes that we all want. So really, security is just a component of risk management. And some other types of risk management, right? You have financial risk management, where someone's scrutinizing investments and contracts in a business, ultimately to limit exposure. And you have legal risk management, where somebody's scrutinizing decisions, operations, strategy, that type of thing, again, to limit exposure. Well, security, somebody like me, is scrutinizing your infrastructure, operations, and your built environment to limit your exposure. And there's lots of others. I just wanted to kind of explain that, security is just one component of overall risk management. So we do use a structured process for this, and I'll give you an overview of that process again so you can understand what the police department's saying, where these conclusions that we're coming to come from. So as you see on your slide there, the risk is really the product, right? It's a multiplicative relationship where you have some kind of asset, you have some kind of thing, some kind of threat to that asset, and some chance that that threat can actually impact the asset. Multiply them all together, and you get a risk level. And we'll dive into these each in the coming slides here. So first of all, in order for there to be risk, there has to be people or stuff, all right? And people and stuff have value. A person's life is, immeasurable in value, but injuries, they have a very real value, and that's whatever you get sued for, because the space, there was some kind of negligence involved with duty to protect and that type of thing. So, that definitely has value. And then equipment, right, that has a very direct and easily understood value, right? It's procurement cost minus depreciation. But there's a second component to value, which is criticality. And this takes a minute for folks to understand sometimes, so it's worth diving into. Not all assets are created equal, and I'll give you some practical examples of that. So if you own a pencil factory, the pencil making machine is absolutely critical to your organization, right? If it breaks, you're not operational. And on the people side of that, if the only person who knows how to run that machine quits, you're at mission failure right now, right? You can't make pencils. So you've hit mission failure. And additionally, any system that feeds that pencil machine is also mission critical, right? And the loss of it will result in failure. So, the electrical system, maybe there's some kind of cooling system, enough to belabor the point, but support systems can also have equal criticality to the assets that they're supporting. So then if we stick with the pencil factory, let's say there's a machine there that packages them into consumer-sized boxes. All right, well, now if that machine goes down, you're looking at a degraded condition. Okay, you can still make your pencils, but maybe you have to subcontract your packaging or only ship in bulk for a while until you can get that machine up. On the people end, think of it as your shipping and receiving person quits. So somebody's got to fill in until you hire a new one, slows down orders going out, that ultimately slows you down in recognizing revenue. You're in a degraded situation. Your business is not running as well as it should be. And then you have inconvenience. So we stay with the pencil factory, the parking lot gets flooded. Everybody's got to park further away, or they have to take mass transit or find some other way to get into work. Or the door the door to the smoking area is broken and it has to stay locked until we can get somebody in to fix it. So, smokers, we got to go out and around the building, and, routines get disrupted, people get grumpy. It's an inconvenience. Maybe there's a long-term morale impact, which moves it up somewhere, but generally it's an inconvenience. On the people end, think of it like your intern twists an ankle playing softball. All right, everybody's got to go get their own coffee. It's inconvenient, but it doesn't have a demonstrable business business impact. So we take all of this and perform a consequence analysis where we look at the assets and understand their value and impact. Following that, we move into a threat assessment. Now, a threat is anything that can impact one of those assets. And they can be natural, like the examples you see there, or they can come from people, and they needn't necessarily be intentional, right? You know, hard drives can crash. A vehicle crashes into a transformer. You know, there's no malicious intent there. Nobody tried to do those things, but they still happened, and they still impact your business. And then we have the criminals and the terrorists, right? These folks have motivation and intent to impact your assets, and that's where we spend the bulk of the time in security dealing with them. There's emergency managers that generally deal with the natural threats and the inadvertent stuff. That's not to say we as professions work hand in hand, you know, ultimately in our job in the risk management world. So all of these threats, they all have some kind of probability. So if you look at your flood maps, for example, I imagine everybody's pretty familiar with those, right? The 100-year flood, that's a probability. And then higher risk zones have a higher probability of damage. And then, you know, you have zones C and X, and they, you know, they have very low probability. Well, we do the same thing with these human threats, all right? And in this day and age, unfortunately, you know, we classify, we have something called ordinary decent crime, all right? This is the regular normal crime that you're dealing with. It's unfortunate that assault falls into, you know, ordinary crime, but that's the world we live in now, post 9/11. With this regular crime, the analysis of it, it's a very mature field. People are using the data all the time. You know, it's understood and it's well reported. All right, local police departments, they report crime statistics to the FBI. That's compiled in something called the Uniform Crime Report, and that data is available. You can perform, you know, analysis that'll stand up to analytical rigor. You can question it. You can, you know, you can mathematically do things with that. And a practical example is auto insurance rates, which vary from neighborhood to neighborhood based on vehicle theft rates. You know, so this is a mature field. And then there's terrorism, right? You can't predict it. Statistics are absolutely meaningless. Any of the thwarted terrorist attacks, they don't come from statistical analysis. They come from really active intelligence gathering efforts, you know, FBI, CIA, undercover stuff. That's not things, we can't plan for that. We can't design for that. That's very, very reactive and, you know, not really part of what we can impact. So to get into the analysis of each type of threat there, here we have ordinary decent crimes. So as we said, we have available statistics and we can use those. So to the right of your slide, you have a crime map of a given location. It's a VA hospital. Now, red bad, green good. So there's a whole lot of red in this neighborhood, and you can see, you know, moving down towards the bottom right of the slide, the crime rate kind of loosens up a little bit, and you know, eventually it'll loosen up to green. But specifically, this is property crime. So what that means is these darker red areas have a higher rate of theft from vehicles, theft of vehicles, and burglaries than the orange areas down towards the bottom right of your screen. So what can we infer from this? Well, it's a hospital, so we have a bunch of patients driving in, and they're parking for hours at a time. We have staff parking for their entire shift, and there's a very real threat of those vehicles being burglarized or even outright stolen. We also have a very real threat of unattended hospital property being stolen. Even something as simple as, you know, an unoccupied building that's storing construction supplies. All of that stuff has value, and for a desperate enough person, you know, they'll take it. So we can take that in, we can take those assets, right? The patient and staff vehicles, that hospital property. We can take all that and use these rates to make an informed risk-based investment decision on what we're going to do about this threat. Now we switch over to terrorism, and you generally can't use past data for this. You know, the World Trade Center, yes, there were 2 attempts on that, and likely more that we, you know, haven't really documented that well. But that's an outlier, all right? Nobody tried to deliver a bomb to the Murrah building before McVeigh did, all right? Nobody went to the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and tried to shoot it up before that crazy guy did, all right? And the list goes on and on and on. And that's why terrorism works, because you can't predict it. It comes from out of the blue. And that's how they're able to achieve the impact that they achieve. So what do? You still have to try to determine some type of likelihood of your facility being targeted. And there's a lot of methodologies for this. Possibly the most sophisticated one comes out of the Sandia National Labs. There's, the military versions, M-Sharp, Carver, ISC. They're way too complicated for this and, quite frankly, not very consumable anyway. One I like to use as a bridge between disciplines here is the KSM methodology. This was proposed by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Norman in his book. And what he did was, long study of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the architect of the 9/11 attacks. And what he did was he attempted to codify the decision-making process that KSM and Al-Qaeda used to, arrive at where did they decide to attack. And in the following slide, we'll step through the elements of that assessment. Again, they're quick, very simplistic examples, but they're intended to give you the idea behind it and how we arrive at the conclusions that we do. So first, does this target fit the organization's strategic objectives? So Al-Qaeda is not going to go attack a research lab where they test medicines on mice. Well, why? Because that's not their mission. That's not their goal in life. Now, on the other hand, the Animal Liberation Front, well, that is their goal in life, and they are going to, target that a facility like that. That's what they do. Secondly, mass casualties are possible. So your Al-Qaedas, your supremacy groups, they need casualties. Okay, they're not going to attack, a public place, the school, stadium, church, whatever, when there's nobody in it. They're not attacking the structure. They need the casualties in order to generate what the next bullet is, which is media attention. They need the exposure. They need the headlines. They need to be relevant. It's free press for them. They don't have to send out flyers, etc. So an assessment of whether the actual physical plant of the target is on media-friendly ground was actually part of the decision-making process. Can the reporters can we get the talking head with your burning building in the background? If yes, then that's a higher likelihood of the target than someplace that's well back beyond the perimeter. You can't see it. There's a wall. Less media friendly. All right, that's another important consideration. And then the next two bullets: economic and cultural importance. So World Trade Center, we'll use that one. All right, there's a lot of finance work going on in there. It's Manhattan. The Manhattan in and of itself is fairly significant. It's a tourist attraction. For a while, it was the tallest building in the world until the Sears Tower eclipsed it, I believe. And I apologize if I'm wrong on my history there. But as you start stripping those things away, the targeting likelihood goes down. So, these groups are looking to do, they're targeting things because it's of some type of importance. The next one, is the target vulnerable, especially to their planned type of attack? Not to talk about terrorism as a business, but bomb making, plane flying, acquiring anthrax, all of this stuff. These cost time, it costs money. Somebody's got to be trained on how to build the bomb, et cetera, et cetera. So if the shooter gets neutralized before he walks in the door, or the bomb gets found by TSA, that's wasted resources for this terrorist organization. Sometimes a significant amount of their manpower will be compromised. So it is they want a return on investment, just like anything else. And that kind of ties into the next one is, is there a probability of success? Is this thing going to work? And then finally, and this is a significantly important one, is this attack going to aid the terrorist organization in recruiting or fundraising, or, somehow, is it going to draw people to the cause? Is it going to inspire others? That's incredibly important to these organizations because, they don't have a meetup account. They're not a Facebook group generally. So an example of that is, the white supremacist group isn't going to go shoot up the VA hospital. Why? Because it's actually going to hurt their cause. People are going to get turned off. Same reason Al-Qaeda is not going to go blow up a mosque. Why? Because that's, exactly the opposite of what they're trying to achieve. So then, with all that in mind, and I know that's pretty heavy stuff, we're gonna switch gears now into vulnerability. All right, and vulnerability, remember, so we have a present threat, we have a present asset. So if that threat can impact that asset, then there's some level of vulnerability. So a concrete bridge might not be particularly vulnerable to a lightning strike, Whereas an electrical transformer, well, that's relatively vulnerable to a lightning strike. Two assets, same threat, but only one is vulnerable. The same goes for crime. So we have two safes right next to each other. One weighs 1,000 pounds, one weighs 50 pounds. One of them you can just steal the whole safe. The other one you actually have to break into it. The vulnerability is different. Same threat, same location even, similar assets. The final example here, a vault made of drywall and studs versus a vault made of 8-inch reinforced concrete. All right, the concrete one, you have to jackhammer or somehow defeat the door lock, whereas the drywall one, you just kick through. Different vulnerabilities, different levels of vulnerability, and ultimately different risk. And the key about vulnerability is this is the only part of the risk equation that we actually, as security professionals, can manipulate. We can impact vulnerability and change how vulnerable an asset is. We can't change whether the asset's there or not, right? Your building, your structure, your campus, your neighborhood, that's already there. It's not going anywhere. Threats, they're present. We don't get to, if we could snap fingers and turn crime off, it'd be a wonderful world, but we don't get to do that. So threats are there. So we only get to mess with vulnerability, and some cheap examples on that. So with the lightning in the transformer, right, we can control that vulnerability by installing a lightning arrest system that channels lightning to ground. If we do the drywall vault, we can replace that wall board with bricks. With the 75-pound safe, we bolt it to the floor with 1-inch bolts. So we've manipulated the vulnerability of those assets, and in this case, we've applied passive measures. If we wanted to do active measures, we could put guards on the safe and vault scenarios. And then, so going back to the SEPTED, this is where that fits in. We can use SEPTED to alter the vulnerability. So back to the risk equation, and then I promise this is it on this theory, and thank you for sticking with me so far. I know it can get dry. So remember your early multiplication classes. What happens when you multiply 0? You get 0. So that's why we're looking to reduce something to 0, in this case vulnerability. We want to make that approach 0. Why? Because then that makes risk go down. So what else do I mean by multiplying by 0? Well, there's no armed guard at my house because there's nothing worth stealing, so I have no assets. There's no anti-volcano measures in Pittsburgh. Why? Because there's no threat. No threat, no risk. That's why the Statue of Liberty hasn't been stolen for copper scrap, right? It's not vulnerable to theft. So, it works. Pardon me. So those examples aside, the more you can get any one of these to approach 0, you get a lower level of risk. And as I said before, security, we're looking to get that vulnerability ideally to 0, but we're going to reduce it as much as budget will allow. So how do we practically apply this? So I'll take you through an example of how this was actually done. I'll take you back to 1983 with the Beirut Barracks bombing. Long and short of it is, if you look at that picture towards the top of your screen, the diagram, the attacker in this scenario had a flatbed tractor-trailer truck. He drove it from the marshalling yard through a barbed wire fence, which wasn't much more than a moral barrier, and then managed to drive around the gate and through a pipe, which again was a moral barrier, and ultimately got his vehicle into the lobby, at which point he detonated, and it caused the collapse of all 4 stories of the building with, a couple hundred people killed. And what you see in the bottom picture is what was left of that 4-story structure. So we had absolute destruction, complete structural failure, and, really just a bad scenario. So we mentioned McVeigh first. So he didn't get into the building, but he got really close. So he was parked maybe, 15, 20 feet from the side of the structure. Again, just keep in mind the 5,000 pounds, because we'll go back to that. But you can see at the top of the picture what the blast waves did to the structure. First, they collapsed the facade. They lifted floors, which caused the structural supports to fall over, and you ended up with partial collapse of the structure. Again, a whole lot of people injured, and 168 killed. The deadliest attack on American soil pre-9/11. So what did we learn from these? Well, we have assets, right? Very high value, people's lives, and not to mention what else is in there. So very high consequence for loss of that. What was our threat? Well, they were all vehicle bombs. We had determined adversaries, so we had a high threat. And vulnerability, what we learned is that when you get bombs detonating nearby, buildings are structurally vulnerable to that type of attack. So we have high risk. So what did we do? Well, we had some engineers, and they went and figured out, what the incident pressure was of these blast waves. So if you look at, about 20 feet, I'll see if I can get this pen working, and I hope I don't screw up the presentation here. So if you look at the green curve, that's Timothy McVeigh's explosive weight. So you can see at about 20 feet here. I hope that's showing up for y'all. We have an obnoxious amount of pressure, right? 3,000, almost 4,000 psi. Just for reference, your vehicle tires that are at about 30 psi. So we have an obnoxious amount of pressure at 20 feet. Well, what happens when we get to 50 feet? Well, now we're down to 100 psi. So we've learned that distance is very, very important in its relationship to blast pressure. So we performed some analysis, and now I have to try to get this pen. So just bear with me for a second. All right, I got it. So going back to that threat equation that I briefed you on, right? Let's turn theory into practical application. We can't manipulate the assets, they're already there. The threat we don't get to manipulate. So how do we manipulate the vulnerability? Well, we have distance, right? If we can achieve more distance between a vehicle and our structure, we reduce the blast pressure on the structure. Well, we can use barriers to enforce that distance. And then we can further add within the structural, we can do blast mitigation measures, reinforce the structure itself to reduce the effects of pressure. So how was this applied? Khobar Towers. So its structure was 1979 in Saudi Arabia, basically unoccupied until we moved some Department of Defense personnel in there in the early 90s. In response to those previous attacks, especially McVeigh, we did go out and perform a number of risk assessments as a community. And some of the measures that the risk assessment recommended was, all right, let's improve our vehicular access control. All right, that's an active measure, but an important one. We're going to put Jersey barriers around the perimeter. All right, that's a passive measure, but we're going to use that to reinforce our distance. And then we're going to remove vegetation from the perimeter fence so we can actually see what's going on out there. All right, very SEPTED type thing to do. All right, and then there were some additional measures that were unable to be implemented. They couldn't buy additional land, and they were unable to install anti-fragmentation films on the windows in time for what's about to happen. So just to take you through the Khobar Towers attack, around 10 p.m., the Air Force guards, I believe they were, noticed that there was a tanker truck. It parked as close as it could get to the edge of the parking lot, and the driver got picked up by a car which sped away. All right, very suspicious. So we have a detection which was enabled by our natural surveillance there. So the sentry evacuated the building, and in 2.5 minutes, a good amount of the floors were completely evacuated, and the remaining people were in stairwells and moving down. And then there was an explosion with some more information that I'll explain later. So the actual explosion, look first at the picture towards the bottom. So when they installed the Jersey barriers, they achieved a distance of 105 feet. Now remember, back to our blast pressure curve, that got us down to around 30 to 40 psi incident blast pressure at that distance. Consequently, we had a whole lot of people get wounded, mostly from fragmenting glass and spall from the facade, but we didn't have a whole lot of people get killed. And a good number of them were outside in the yard anyway, which wouldn't have helped. So this shows you how you can actually, a practical application of stepping through threat analysis and actually achieving, I hate to call it an outcome where, a whole bunch of people got wounded, better, but it's certainly better than them getting killed. We were able to, and clearly able to prevent, aside from the front facade, able to prevent the building from being totally destroyed. All right, so from the top left, this is kind of what I want to step you through here now is, we've talked about how a security person uses that risk equation. Now, how do you do all these analysis, with respect to your actual job and your actual function? So asset and criticality analysis. this doesn't come from the security consultant. This doesn't come from the police department. This comes from your COO types, your president, the users of the equipment. They know what's critical, they know what's important, and they know what it costs. So that, even when I do an analysis, a criticality analysis, it's with data supplied by the users. It's not something that I generate in a vacuum. Threats, some users, particularly IT types, pharmacy types, they'll be able to give you a decent portion of your threat data. The rest comes from crime data, like anybody can download the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. You can Google it and pull it down. It's not particularly consumable. There's companies that specialize in making consumable products out of that data, like the red map I showed you. And then there's external support. So, your police department, they might be able to do this for you. Your emergency manager, and of course, consultants like me. Vulnerability assessment. Now, this is definitely not a DIY thing, all right? This is where you need that external support. And depending on the nature of your business or the nature of your facility or campus, you might be able to get free support from police. For example, in the state of Pennsylvania, they will perform free vulnerability assessments on any place of worship. So this support isn't there. You don't have to just hire security consultants. There's multiple venues for getting the assistance that you need. But ultimately, we put all of those together using the risk equation. All right, and I just want to reiterate the business case for involving security early. All right, early on in the design process, early on in the planning process, when things are just conceptual and they're sketches, we can make changes and we can get passive measures integrated from the beginning. Why is that important? You're not paying by the hour for those, right? Human labor is always very expensive. And if you properly design those passive measures, you can reduce the number of active measures that you need. And then finally, we move to filling the gaps with those active measures, be it staff, security guards, police officers, cameras, alarms. We're using those. We want to use those as gap filling measures. So you'll notice I've gone 47 some odd minutes. Take a few out for when Tiffany was giving her portion. So we've gone about 45 minutes on a security presentation, and I did not talk to you about the latest in facial recognition technology or access control hardware or what's the best alarm system, because we don't. That's the tail end of security. Not the bulk of the work should be happening up front, and that's the message we're trying to get across. And finally, we do have some randoms. This is my take on some things you can do with my better understanding of having worked with Tiffany for a number of years and learning how the types of things planners are interested in. So this is how SEPTED type things can be incorporated into your planning process. Now, I realize there's a million other things that go into zoning, et cetera, like that. And there's a lot of other considerations other than security that affect zoning decisions. But diversity is key. All right, you need a lot of engaged residents, and you want to avoid sameness. All right, so a bedroom community where everybody goes to work at the whole complex is empty at 7 and nobody returns until 9 at night. You're going to see a significant amount of property crime happening during the day. Homogeny is very bad. You want eyes on the street during the daytime. If you don't have that because everybody's gone, well, then you have to start hiring guards. You have to start increasing police patrols, and that either drives up taxes or rental costs, as the case may be. Retirees, try not to price them out of neighborhoods. I know that's not. I'm not trying to get political, I promise, but anything you can do to keep a population of retirees around, that's huge, because they're around all day and they've been there forever. They notice everything. My parents are retired. They believe me, they notice everything, and they'll call the cops about anything. My dad will call the police because he's bored. Stay-at-home parents, also very important. All right, you want to try not to price out your single-income families. If any of you have kids, remember your first one, and remember, the ages 1 to 3, right? Parents of children, they're hyper aware of just about every threat imaginable, from people driving too fast to germs to anything. And if you don't believe me on that, go find a playground where there's moms and kids playing at noon. Put on a trench coat and some sunglasses, stand there, and start your stopwatch and see how long it takes for the cops to come. All right, stay-at-home parents are super vigilant, and then be mindful of your tax impacts, because that starts pricing people out. Public spaces, green space. There's multiple studies on this that I've read. There's overall seems to be a consensus that green space, except for in the absolute most stubborn communities, and we're talking like Camden, New Jersey, where the crime is just going to be there, and we have other problems afoot. There's a very significant correlation between the amount of green space and the reduction in overall crime. And finally, go back to your septet, right? As you pursue developments, get lawns on these things. Get small gardens for the residents to use, porches, anything you can do to get that attention directed outward. Because you want people sitting out front and seeing what goes on the street. You want people looking out windows. You want kids playing outside so you can see, more eyes, see something, say something. I think that brings us to the end of me. Yep, and I'll turn it over to Tiffany.
So we just, throughout the presentation, touched on a lot of themes. Just wanted to summarize some of the key elements and takeaways for the group. So essentially, at the start, we talked about multidisciplinary approach, integrating physical security specialists into your team from the start. The planner's expertise is not one of detailed security review. So, just engage the folks that can bring the right expertise at the right time, so that project decisions around safety are not just by feel or feedback, but through data and analytical methods. Bringing these right professionals in also increases credibility with plan reviewers, because they have a technical expert to ask questions of, and they improve the design of urban designers, architects, and others. So, that's really critical. Changes driven by requirements early in the process are obviously less expensive and disruptive. The security overlay is really important during site selection and master planning, and that's a lot of the times when Herb and I are working together very, very closely in the projects that we deliver. Balancing septet with the achievement of the design vision for a project is really important. We talked about seamlessness, about invisibility. Those are the types of spaces and places that people feel comfortable in and frequent, because it's not, they don't see those elements, forefront. Integrating security into planning and other projects from the start, will allow for more sophisticated solutions and relevant solutions, so that, again, you're not looking at all of this tech on the back end to kind of try to cover for the things that weren't thought about right from the design itself. So all of these things really, focused on future-proofing, right? So there's a lot of talk about first cost, but, you also have to think about security design early, and the insights it provides for, future planning in the case of organizations, campus districts or development. So, the key thing for us is that, facility design is not just about first cost, but about integrating over time and creating inherently safe spaces in the future as well. So there's a lot of typical planning considerations to think about, but there are also security considerations that follow those in just a different light. And those things working together really make for the best projects. So in closing, we just want to thank you again for your attention this afternoon. We hope you got a lot of practical strategies and ideas from the presentation. And if nothing else, learn that having security professionals on your team can bring a lot of important data and a perspective at the beginning of projects at various scales that really bring value to those projects. Using data versus impressions while projects are being conceptualized and reviewed is just really important. So with that, we're happy to take any comments or questions. And again, thank you for your time and attention this afternoon.
Thank you, Herb. I was laughing out loud when you were talking about moms at playgrounds, because when I'm out and, I have my super sonar, mom sonar on, I get this like weird feeling on the back of my neck when I know something just isn't right. And I have to tell you all a quick story. Maybe 6 years ago. I was working from home, and we lived in a nice condo, a rental condo in a really nice neighborhood. And my office desk was overlooked a window out into the communal parking area. And I just saw weird activity for like 3 days in a row, and just strange things were happening. And so I happened to mention it to one of the folks at the rental office. And about half an hour later, a bunch of stuff had been stolen out of all the community garage, or out of all the communal garages. And a day later, it turns out that the neighbor next to me that I thought was just a little off was a really important heroin dealer who I had accidentally, I guess, but for the good, teed off for police. So I'll tell you what, it just having people aware and having people make those calls and comments when something doesn't seem right. I mean, look what can happen. So
great septet practice facing your desk out the window.
It's what?
It's great septet practice by facing your chair out the window.
Exactly. So we have a bunch of questions, so let's jump into them and see how far we can get in the amount of time we have left here. Okay, first question. This is a great one. How can a small community incentivize developers to incorporate crime prevention through environmental design, the CPTD elements, when they're more expensive than even what the city code requires? How can we incentivize them?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I could answer that completely, I'd probably be the mayor of a town somewhere. That's a challenge that impacts a lot of communities, and ultimately, right, green space is more expensive. It doesn't generate revenue. It's not square footage that you can sell necessarily. And it's unfortunately one of the items that planning boards have to consider, and that's why I said on that final slide I presented that it's purely a security perspective, because there are other things that go into it. The townships need their ratables, and you have certain costs, and you have certain legal obligations that you have to fulfill. So I'm not trying to duck the question. It's taking square footage that you could be selling or taxing and turning it into non-taxable stuff. There's aside from possibly seeking grants or the funding from some of the environmental organizations that might be interested. Those are possibilities. I've never actually seen it done. The state where I live, New Jersey, there's talk about a potential taxation of non-permeable soil. So the more driveway you put up, the more rooftop you put up, you'll pay a larger portion of stormwater tax. I'm not fully conversant on the legislation, but that's part of the intent of it anyway, is to reduce runoff. So you can present it, in those terms. We have a cost avoidance because we're keeping a certain amount of green space and a certain amount of permeable soil. Tiffany, do you have any ideas on that?
Not specifically. I mean, I always go back to, it's difficult to incentivize, but perhaps, perhaps even just raising these issues beyond the community feedback that you might receive on projects, but, even raising these issues to the developer. Have you consulted any security professionals? Like, what's your take? Like, how are you going to handle this? Like, what's your impression of the neighborhood? Have you, ran any data on, the neighborhood and the risk? I mean, you could just ask for things, maybe be a more informed planner or reviewer of a project and just see what happens. But, I think it's, incentivizing is that's a tough one. But I think, like, the awareness of, the more awareness you have as a planner to try to integrate these strategies and ask for them from teams or make them part of a review process, I think the more you're at least going to start the conversation. And hopefully from there you can get where you need to be for your community.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How do you specifically evaluate gender-based risk, and how do you integrate gender into planning and designing for safety and security?
So from a security perspective, we generally don't dive that deep into specific genders, and that's probably more a function of the types of projects I've had. It's the threats threats to one or threats to all. I do understand that statistically there's certain crimes happen to women more than men and vice versa, but generally we don't go into that type of thing.
Okay, thank you. Next question. We found it difficult to codify crime prevention through environmental design concepts for our reviews, but make sure that written recommendations of certified crime prevention through environmental design professionals are preserved in the review files for potential future liability litigation. This procedure has helped to make the recommendations taken more seriously by the applicant's design team. So this isn't a question. This is just a comment that came in from someone who wanted to
That's
give their
great to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Next, this is a question. Thoughts about broad public involvement in security planning versus working quietly in the background?
I'm sorry, say that again, please.
Thoughts about broad public involvement in security planning versus working quietly in the background?
So I'd say, for one, it goes back to the awareness. You have certain communities where they're pushing things like see something, say something more. Like New York City's an example of that. At the airports, right, you got the constant TSA announcement that's always droning on. Report unattended baggage to the nearest authority before it'll be destroyed. So there's value in that, and in general, I mean, that goes back to it's almost a societal thing, and I'm not going to try to get too philosophical, but as we kind of realize that we've gotten out of like the 80s and 90s where it's just ignore everything because it's not my problem, and now we're starting to be more cognizant of a whole lot of things that go on in society, not just crime. I think people are just in general becoming more engaged, and it's more of a societal shift. So we can encourage it, and at the smaller levels within organizational culture, or even within smaller towns and stuff. As we can get communiques out from the mayor, from the police department on Facebook and stuff. Just a reminder that see something, say something. Everybody has a role. Also, you'll see a number of police departments are engaging over these social media channels, and they're posting sometimes very funny things. Sometimes they're posting things like they pulled a cat out of a storm drain, I saw. But they're posting stuff which gets eyes on the stuff, and eventually they can work in some crime prevention tips. That you all might have seen one. All right, you're going away. Get your papers. Well, if anybody even gets a paper anymore, but have the papers stopped. Have a neighbor check on your thing. Have timers, that kind of thing. We've got the ability to spread information a lot better. So as we take advantage of this improved societal engagement, we can hopefully achieve better outcomes. I hope that somewhat answered the question. But Tiffany, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think as, a planner working in kind of community meetings a lot, you get very important but bland messages about, it's just, we want to be safe. I mean, everyone wants to be safe, right? And I think the thing working with Herb that's been really helpful to me is to kind of, do a risk, get your map of your community and look at the various neighborhoods and see where the risk really is in terms of the data, instead of, merely going by, they're all data points, I guess, in one way, right? Like, you want the data points in the feedback of the community, the various streets within a neighborhood, things like that. But you also want some hard data as well. And that's something that, in Herb's expertise, he can bring and help or point you to that would just be another data point when you're going through a planning process, so that you really have a better sense of what's going on more holistically, instead of just kind of going on feel or only community feedback, though that is important. But in terms of do you, maybe the questions about, how much do you say to the public, or how much do you work quietly in the background? I mean, on projects, you could certainly start with the project team that's proposing something and see what, like we said earlier, see what they're up to in terms of thinking about these things. And then, as a neighborhood planner, you might know already, your communities that you're working in, so maybe the data helps you out. But I mean, I don't think it's something that, you to hide, but I definitely, in my experience, it's better to have that data to balance with the impressions. And between those two things, usually you get a pretty good sense of, what the situation exists in a community and how the project, may or may not affect that when new projects are being built. Right,
and just to quickly tag on to the end of that, the background stuff, that's more of the active side. That's a more law enforcement type thing, where there's investigations going on, where there's FBI doing their thing. That's more into that stuff you want in the background. That stuff should be transparent. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of stuff that does happen in the background. As far as the security profession, I mean, we want to be visible. Now visible doesn't mean intrusive, but we want it to be visible. We want, to be a part of this process. We want to be out front with it. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. So related to that, and we've all heard about some of these issues that have come up in the news in the past several years. How do we encourage citizens to be protective of their community without encouraging profiling?
Yeah, so profiling in and of itself is, wrong, let's say, a lack of a better term, right? There's nothing right about that. That being said, what looks out of place generally is out of place, and it's behavior that's out of place. It's, take me, myself, and put, punk rock clothes on, and, I don't shave for 3 weeks, and I look like a mess. I go walking around some, ritzy neighborhood. Like I look like I don't belong there. So that should draw attention. And, if I start acting any more out of place, I go to a house that I clearly don't own because it's a community, right? And the neighbors all know each other. So now there's this, guy that's clearly not the Orkin man, or, he clearly has no legitimate purpose for knocking on somebody's front door, and now I'm knocking on somebody's front door. So is that profiling? Is it not? I mean, it's somebody that's out of place doing something that they, visibly don't see. So again, we sort to move into the law enforcement category, because it's really what happens after that gets reported. And that again switches to, a policing context where, the police officer comes and asks me what I'm doing, and whether my rights are properly respected or not at that point, and how I'm treated in the criminal justice system. I mean, that's really outside the ability of security or even the planner, right? You just want to make that detection possible. So we're all about just making that allowing the neighborhood to have that happen, have that detection happen. How it's treated beyond detection, that's just kind of beyond what we're able to impact.
All right, next question. Could you share any experiences you had with balancing security with inclusivity, particularly in public facilities like libraries?
Yeah, so we've done a fair amount of work at hospitals. So, I mean, hospitals are all about patient access. So, you can't, and anything that impedes access to healthcare, it's a bad, even business-wise, it's bad for the hospital, let alone anything else. So, the being open to anybody, in the medical emergencies, they know no race, they know no gender, right? Mm-hmm. People get sick. So what you're doing, from a security perspective is you want to be, you have to maintain that public openness. You have to, maintain the business flow of the space. You can't just impede operations because it makes the facility more secure. So you start doing things like, unfortunately, you have to you resort to more active measures where you have, a security guard that's just off the waiting room for the emergency department, for example. So it's there, it's out of the way, but available. So those are the types of things that we do, to operate, to secure the space while at the same time, allowing for that inclusive openness. Too often the perception is that we have metal detectors, that we have, ID checkers, et cetera, et cetera. Those are reserved for, you have to reserve those from good practice wise, for your most vulnerable things. Like if you think about like a football stadium or a baseball stadium, all right, when that's full of people, that's a hell of a target for terrorists. So they're going to be doing those more intrusive things like bag checks and metal detector screenings. That being said, we get to the inclusiveness or the kind of tying into that profiling question, is how all those patrons are being treated, and is, a certain gender or a certain ethnicity or a certain, age group of people being, singled out for additional inspections. It's certainly not in the interest of any security company to develop that kind of perception. It's bad for the clients. It results in lawsuits, and security is about reducing your exposure, not increasing it. So it's bad business if it's happening, and if it's happening, you have there's somebody screwed up in leadership. That's the best I could tell you.
Okay, next question. What are some good sources for security statistics?
First and foremost, the FBI UCR, the Uniform Crime Report. You can Google it. It comes in a series of Excel tables, and it's just raw data. But that's the authoritative source for crime rates. Anybody, you can find things on the web. We use a company called Security Gauge, which provided that diagram there. I think Neighborhood Scout's another one. A lot of the realty sites, believe it or not, are getting into crime maps. So they'll take that data and put it into a more consumable form. But it's publicly available. You don't even have to do FOIA for it. It's literally published to the web. You don't need an account. You don't need anything. You can just go download it. So there's various ways you can get that data in a more packaged form. Moving on to some of the more restricted data. Most municipalities, or at least larger urban areas, have something called a fusion center, which is supposed to be a coordination cell for local, state, federal law enforcement entities, of all flavors, to collaborate primarily on anti-terrorism data. Other sources, again, your local police or your state police, depending on the nature of your community or what's available in your state, they'll have resources, especially if the more public your organization is, the more resources you have access to. So a municipal planning board should be able to get these things for at no cost, or at least for very minimal cost. Once you get outside the government spaces, then access to that becomes significantly more difficult, and it gets restricted on a need-to-know basis. For those communities, if your police departments aren't a member of it, there's the DHS. It's called I always get the acronym screwed up. It's the Homeland Security Intelligence Network. It's a controlled access site. You have to apply for an account and be vetted. It's not particularly costly or anything like that. As a matter of fact, it's free, but you have to be affiliated with the government in some aspect to get access to that. From there, there's a number of sites in there that can provide some restricted access type information that you're not going to be able to get. Another one is SLAT, SLATT.org, State and Local Anti-Terrorism Training. Again, you have to be connected to, in some kind of governmental function in order to ask for access to that. But that's another source of information available. And then there's other things. Some of them have gotten a little politically charged lately, but we used to, even in the Marine Corps until rather recently, we were able to use the SPLC to get an idea of hate groups. I still think it's useful if you go on the SPLC's Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC's website. They have something called the hate map. It's not 100% accurate, and some of their, they had there was a bar that was putting up, at the time it was during the Obama administration, and there was a bar that was putting up signs that said impeach Obama, and they listed it as a hate group. So the SPLC is not an authoritative source, but it can give you an idea of what's out there. And there's we all know that the KKK is not up to anything socially responsible. So you can see who's operating in various cities. Again, it's not authoritative data. It's not something anybody would use at trial, but it's another source of information, certainly.
Thank you. Next question. What resources would you recommend specifically for communities concerned about preventing violence and security breaches in K-12 schools?
Well, school security, that's going to continue to be a tough one. There's not a national repository of authoritative information on that, at least that I'm aware of. If you were to, I guess if we were to try to scope a project for it, I mean, what you would do is you'd start off with a risk assessment of the structure. Because remember, a lot of times you don't want to just apply security measures, right? We need to make sure there's a risk. So every school is different. Certain schools have too many doors open during the day. Certain schools have, the building where the students are dropped off, it's too close to, high-speed traffic. So every school is different. So you really do have to assess each individual one, in the context of the given threats, to really come up with a good set of recommendations for investment. And even if we take the big threat, which I'm assuming everybody's probably most concerned with, which is the school shooting. Again, each school is less vulnerable or more vulnerable to that depending on how the building is laid out and designed. So you really have to assess the individual structure. You can't just do a blanket assessment of we need to put metal detectors in schools, or we need to, outfit every first story, school window with, ballistic glass. You can't just put these blanket assessments in. Generally some best practices, if you will, although I hesitate to call them exactly that. Lockdown capability, if you had some kind of electronic access control system where you can have the fire door shut and lock in the event that there was a shooting. You'll see a lot of schools where they have red cards to be able to do that. So an electronic access control system is, generally a good idea, especially if it has lockdown capability where at least you can confine the shooter to a smaller portion of the school. Other ones, I'm hit or miss on the whole door locking thing because that can be good or bad. So I'm hesitant to provide any, and there's a million products for it. Some of them are absolute jokes, and some of them, could be functional, and a lot of them run afoul of fire codes. So the other thing is they might open up additional venues of attack. So right now the terrorist threat is somebody shooting up the school. Well, terrorists continue to learn, and school shooters are going to continue to learn. So what's the next step? Everybody's locked in a classroom. All right, well, now they're stuck in there. I'm going to throw something in, like a tank of chlorine or something like that. So, I mean, it can always get, you really have to just do it on a case-by-case basis and see what's available. There's just not, other than that access control and the ability to lock certain areas of the school down, Cameras, they'll help the response force if there's some kind of place where, those cameras are monitored. You can, depending on the nature of it, if the police department's so equipped, you can have, the incident commander actually be able to go into an area and view the where the shooter is in the property and direct officers as needed. That's certainly a bonus. But other than that, I don't have any real blanket stuff I could throw out for you.
I guess one thing, at least that just popped into my mind when my husband was in school, he had to go through ALICE training. I don't know if you're familiar with that, or if that's something that municipalities can at least have their staff undertake, or even schools, administrative folks could take that kind of training. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, so the thing with all of those trainings is it really does vary between different jurisdictions and different school boards as to whether they're going to do that. And so I'm of the opinion that, any kind of training is good training, even if you, decide ultimately that that's not the way you're going to do things. The thing about all that training is it's really got to be coordinated through whoever the response force is at that location, because that's going to impact the types of things that you train on and the various components of that training. So again, I would really defer that to the local authorities to start with them. But yes, it's good to ask about, these ALICE classes. Is that something that would apply in our district? Is that something we want to, invest time and resources into?
Okay, there are still a ton of questions, but one that has popped up now several times is in regard to active shooters, and how, as planners, what can we do to plan for active shooters?
In short, not much. Because active shooting is a form of terrorism, right? And
right.
that is a very hard one for us, as designers and people that are upstream of the crime, to be able to do. What you wanted, the best thing you can do until there is a damn near, it's almost 100% that once the response force shows up and engages the shooter, the civilian casualties stop. I think the percentage is ridiculous. It's 99 point something % of the occurrences, and that's school shootings, workplace shootings, mass shootings, whatever. So the key is to reduce the amount of people exposed to that gunfire until the response force can arrive. So there's multiple ways to achieve that outcome. One being have the response force in the school. Then again, you have Broward County, Florida, where that didn't work at all. But in theory, it should have worked. The other is that you have things like this lockdown capability where you can, restrict the shooter's flow through the school and slow him down in order to buy more time for the response force to get there and engage. That's really all I've got on that. You can make those types of infrastructure investments. Detection, generally it's very hard to detect. You can conceal weapons fairly easily. And then even if you detect it, if there's not somebody there to do anything about it, or you don't have the ability to lock down your facility, then there's not much you can do about it anyway.
Okay, well, it is 2:30. We're going to wrap up. This was fascinating. So thank you, Tiffany and Herb, for joining us. And Herb, thank you for your past service to our country. And thanks to the Pennsylvania chapter for hosting today's session. This isn't something that we talk about very often, so this was really interesting. And we had over 500 folks on the line. So just as a reminder for everyone, we are recording this session. I'll post it up on our YouTube channel as soon as I can get it downloaded. And we'll also have a PDF copy of this available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So again, Tiffany and Herb, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Bye.
Thank you.